Hi there, everybody. I'm Philip Eidson, and welcome to episode 254 of The Art of Procurement. Before I start, I just want to quickly let you know that we'll be publishing May's This Month in Procurement next week, rather than today, which is the last Monday of the month and what we typically aim for. But fear not, it will be on, and if all goes to plan, we're going to be bringing news of an exciting new product announcement. I'll also be introducing you to Mark Pollock and Elijah Condalone, who, if you missed the announcement a couple of weeks ago, they recently joined Art of Procurement as my fellow partners. So stay tuned for that one next week. So as many of you will know, earlier in the year, we kicked off a sponsored webinar series called AOP Live. AOP Live sessions allow procurement professionals and subject matter experts to actually explore a specific topic in real time. So unlike traditional pre-recorded podcasts like we typically have on Art of Procurement, and canned webinars, so those that are typically driven by, a presenter going through a bunch of slides, these are highly dynamic and they're actually designed to facilitate interaction between all parties, both before, during, and after the session. And so today's podcast is actually a recording of our most recent AOP Live session. It happened last month. It featured Anthony Clervi, and Anthony is president and CEO of UNA, a group purchasing organization, or GPO, as you may have heard them be called. So Anthony joined us last month for AOP Live. In that session, we were proposing an alternative approach to automating procurement, so one that doesn't involve robots and doesn't cost a dime. If you enjoy the discussion once you've listened to the pod, I'd highly recommend you download the accompanying ebook that we have developed with UNA. We have pulled out a number of the questions and answers from the show, summarized the key takeaways, and provided a checklist of questions to really help you assess your current situation relative to whether you should consider a GPO or not, how to define success, get better buy-in with stakeholders. You can download the ebook at artofprocurement.com/254download. 254 is the episode number for today. So that's artofprocurement.com/254download. Okay, so let's jump right in, where I ask Anthony if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Procurement chose me. UNA started roughly about 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was really just under a concept of how can we save businesses money, save them time, bring them disproportionate value. But by no means did I go to school for this. I have a business degree, economics major from a small school in Illinois, played baseball for 4 years. My dad was an artist. You can see the cactus.
Yeah, we were just talking about that beforehand.
Yeah. So people ask me, am I an artist? And I would say it's underdeveloped talent. My talents went elsewhere. But no, I just fell into procurement. I think what's been a joyous ride is trying to figure out this whole space and where the opportunity is and how big of an impact you can have if you really know what you're doing.
So I have to ask you, what was your position in baseball?
So I played in the corners, left and right field. And I was a pitcher in high school, but I had such a low arm angle. I actually had to switch, and then I was so aggressive at the plate, so sometimes it would go well, sometimes it wouldn't. My batting average, if you Google my name, is less to be desired. It was obvious.
So anyone listening?
Yeah, it was obvious.
Google your name.
Yeah, it was obvious I was just going to get an education and not go on. But I enjoyed the opportunity. It was fun.
So I want to ask about GPOs. And the first question really is, you talk to a lot of people, obviously, about GPOs, about the GPO value proposition. What's the number one misconception that you encounter?
So number one, I think it's just that you're stuck maybe. This concept that if you work with a GPO, you lack control. I think that's the better word.
Right.
And I would want to go after that misnomer with a simple understanding. I think it's a good question. I immediately think of the phrase I'm going to quote one thing, and I won't keep quoting, but maybe I shouldn't make that promise. Mark Twain says, it's not what you don't know that'll hurt you. It's what you think isn't so, right? So it's just this concept of like, well, that's not true, but it ain't. It is true. So just the reality of the education of knowing, well, I think that it's a certain way, but that actually isn't the way that it is. And so for me, it's understanding, well, where is it let me back up a second. So thinking through, what is it you're trying to accomplish, right? What is it you're trying to accomplish as a business? And, just starting from there. So I think for GPOs and what the misconceptions are and what you can do as a business and who it applies to, I think I always want to try to back up. You said we've talked to a lot of end users. Where is it that you're starting from? What is your general understanding of the space? What is it you're trying to accomplish? So I hate to answer a question with a question, but those are the things that come up. And then just wearing that entrepreneurial sales hat as we have these conversations with medium and large size enterprises, we like to really start with, let's not make assumptions and let's try to really understand what's going on and be careful to make promises before we have a clue about what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, well, I want to dig a little bit into those. Before I do, and maybe this is a question I should have asked at the very beginning, just to provide some context. For those who aren't that familiar with a GPO model, how do you explain what a GPO is to those who haven't really come across it before?
Sure, I think the simplest way, it's kind of like Costco for business, right? Without the membership, it's this concept where you can leverage a bunch of buying and save money. But ultimately, there's many different ways that GPOs have funded themselves commercially or in the marketplace. You have the traditional sense where you'll negotiate with suppliers and build in what is called admin fees. And I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with that. And the admin fees can range from specific anywhere from a couple points to a couple, 1 to 2% to up to 5 to 6%, depending on the market. If it's in healthcare, there's some pretty strict guidelines from safe harbor and healthcare, et cetera. But then if you're extending out in just the general business community like your followers and we at UNA try to pursue, the admin fees can change. And so it's really based on the suppliers paying us by bringing value to the end user, which in turn, you have two customers. We have our suppliers who we consider a customer, and then you have the end user actually taking advantage of the contract or that category. And then the other models that we've seen, and I think it's worked, it's not what we do at UNA, but I think it's still a valuable concept, is you get back to that consultative, okay, you have a conversation with an enterprise or maybe they have multiple locations, wide categories of spend, and we go out a GPO or a solution would go out and negotiate that contract on their behalf. And there's sometimes an opportunity of sharing in that savings, right? Where the actual GPO that did the heavy lifting from the procurement standpoint, working with their team, and then the end user, of course, would share in that savings as well.
I think one of the misconceptions I hear about GPOs is that they're only for small businesses. And honestly, that's kind of what my perspective was before I started to learn a little bit more, as I kind of progressed in my procurement career. Do you hear that as well a lot?
I hear it a little bit. I'm curious, why did you hear that? Was it education or just the market?
It's probably education. You know what? I think one of the things is, when you're in a larger organization, so some of the companies that I were in were, $20 billion plus organizations, you kind of have this perception that maybe it's the not invented here syndrome of, everything that we do has to be driven from our team. We have to be in control of all the spend. And that perhaps a GPO is for a mom and pop shop who they don't have a procurement group, they really don't have any negotiating power, so it's a no-brainer for them to all collectively come together and get a better deal than any one of them could on their own. And I think from that perspective means that in a large, again, my experience was that you kind of dismiss GPOs a little bit when you're in a larger organization.
Well, it kind of gets back to that. I won't go after the Mark Twain quote, but it's the mind is like a parachute, only works if it's open. So at the end of the day, who are you sitting across from and having that conversation with? And obviously at a $20 billion organization, you're a big dog, where it's amazing the little pups that are out there that are not 20 billion, but they're very large organizations. So I think it is education. I think it's assumptions. Obviously maybe not obviously, but assumptively, the genesis of GPOs really did start in healthcare. And it's been kind of this inverse understanding where it started in healthcare, and really to get into the healthcare space, you typically have to go through a GPO. But in the business community, we kind of call it like the Wild West, right? So we have seen some of that the mom and pops, everybody's got a relative term. What is mom and pop? Well, anybody less than 1,000 employees, and some of that doesn't always dictate what the spend will be in the category so it just kind of depends. And I think there needs to be an understanding that I wouldn't recommend a GPO to every end user or business. I think it really depends on strategy, goals, et cetera, et cetera.
When you think about examples of GPO usages in large companies, I mean, what does that look like? Is that a portion of spend, one category, two categories? What's the model usually when you are getting yourself into a larger organization, or when a GPO is getting into a larger organization?
Sure. So I can think of a specific example where typically what will happen in a larger organization, we're talking, I think in a healthy 5,000, 10,000 plus employees, is we've been referred in through consultants that are looking at a couple categories. Maybe it's travel, maybe it's office supplies, maybe it's MRO. And what's happening is you're seeing things happen from a reactive standpoint. They're hiring a consultant, they're doing many other processes and procedures. They don't have an SOP for these specific categories. They've made some acquisitions, and so they have this reactive, okay, we have to go in and fix this. We have to accomplish two things. We need to standardize and to develop an SOP. Well, now we need the contracts, and we need them quickly, or we need to figure out a way to either we're going to negotiate them on our own or go outside. And so what we've found, and that's a specific example, it came down to travel and actually office supplies, and it's evolved into furniture. But we help them automate or excuse me, really identify an SOP for 3 or 4 companies that they had just acquired. They were developing the shared services model. And then obviously we were able to provide the contracts as well. And we encourage them, let's start with a couple. And I don't care if you've got, again, you're looking to target many various categories or commodities over certain you've got 10 categories maybe that you think that you would fit or plug or look at, or whatever language you want to use. We always try to recommend, and I would, anyone out there working with a GPO, start with a few, start with 1 or 2 categories. Get your feet wet, understand what's the relationship like. Is this an opportunity where I can outsource but still have control and feel like they're a part of my team, or is it just going to be a transactional one and done?
Yeah, you talked about the categories, and there's a question that Sarah asked beforehand. Are there some categories that are the sweet spot for a GPO?
Sweet spot. So I think every GPO would maybe answer this a little bit differently, but I think if you think indirect, depending on the end user, if it's healthcare or non-municipality, just general business, I think of telecommunications or IT. I think of office supplies in general, but I probably lean more towards janitorial or MRO, or maybe even on the direct side, depending on the business, food distribution. There's some other really good distribution opportunities out there that can be very opportunistic. Capital purchases, everything. I don't want to get specific with name brands, but if you get into like copiers or some of that, there's some extraordinary opportunities in some of those categories that may not seem sexy, but depending on the locations and sites can really add up.
It's a kind of a tactical question to follow on, and it's something you talked about in the example of, an organization, for example, a large company, they have multiple acquisitions, trying to get their hands around a category. As you're looking at then implementing a GPO model for that category, do you have to wait until all the contracts are expiring that they already have? Or are you able to, is there something that you can do where, you're not waiting for 3 years until the last contract expires, but you can bring the spend in today?
Well, so it gets a little bit tricky, right? So this is where an attorney would have a different opinion, but sometimes what did the previous incumbent or supplier do to win that business? Was there a payment made? What is the contractual obligation? Again, I've always kind of stressed carefully, you shouldn't be getting any kind of agreement where you can just never get out. There's usually some kind of clause, so you're never really stuck. There could be some unwinding, let's say, consequences. So hopefully that answers.
Contract by contract basis. You got to look on a contract basis.
I think it's understanding what is the urgency of the nature of this transition. Is it a supplier issue? Is it service, which could be supplier service, one and the same. Is that, well, we really have just, our C-suite is demanding a different SKU set, or we want to switch distributors, or we think we can get better manufacturer agreements through this other GPO. Ultimately, if you're at that point where there's so much urgency, you can make the transition. You'll have to deal with the unwind.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's trying to figure out, excuse me, okay, you're making the transition. What's beautiful about the GPO, and then ideally, if there's enough of a relationship with that GPO and the suppliers, depending on the situation, if there's committed volume and that's over a certain amount of time, it's amazing what those suppliers will do. It's simply amazing.
And Kelly, I think you wanted to jump in for a second.
I do actually, and this is a good reminder to everybody. You know, we have a lot of questions that were submitted at the point of registration, but you're welcome to use the questions box in your navigation pane if something occurs to you as we go. And we do have something that has come in, and Anthony, this is actually a commonality to almost everything that we've discussed in an AOP live session, is that professionals want to know how this approach reflects on procurement's priorities, procurement's performance objectives, and procurement's metrics. So we talked a little bit about, is it big companies, small companies? Is it this category of spend or that? People are asking, does it have to be that savings is the primary objective in the category or in the contract in order for a GPO management model to make sense?
Well, the quick answer is no. I would prefer the end user tell me what does success look like, and maybe it's so open-ended. Well, that's why we're asking the question. So I hate to answer a question with a question, but that's typically what we understand. The need that's coming to us, and I'll use Una as an example, or GPOs in general, is the business is coming to us, and maybe they've gone through acquisitions or multiple locations, and they just don't have a command on the data and the spend. And so it could be an opportunity for time savings from a data perspective. You know, we have some interesting tools at Una, or just in general, there are other competitors out there that are really starting, and I hope that they are in this space of really trying to understand data and helping the end user wrap their mind around the data and have it at their disposal. So not only for the end user, the business, with all the locations and all and the compliance opportunities there, or I say opportunities because it's usually a challenge. But you know, you asked me directly, it seemed like you were positioning it, does it have to be? And there's a lot of things that don't have to be, but it can't just be a constant open-ended scenario. So when I think about the initial question around cost and value, I really have to go back to what is it that this business is trying to accomplish? Why? How did you end up at a conversation with the GPO? And obviously, it's kind of an assumed understanding that there is going to be savings with partnering with the GPO, depending on the category. And so what we've tried to do as a brand, and I would encourage the marketplace, I think the market will lead this as well, just the sheer Darwinism of competition, is what else can you do for the end user? Okay, what does data management mean? What is using technology? How is that really helpful? Is there a cost to that? Is it more strategic and plug and play, or should we be thinking about something over the next 5 to 10 years? Is that something I can get from the GPO, or should I go elsewhere? So there's just so many questions and ramifications around what you just teed up. But those are the things that go off in my mind, the bells. And so through multiple conversations and sit downs, hopefully you can start to get a grasp on that, or bring in other third parties to shed some light on that. Here's another thing that I find it's a real challenge and a reality is, I'm a procurement professional, or a buyer, or a sourcing manager, or even a CPO with a team, or multiple people on my team. Why do I need a GPO, right? Why are you going to help me? Or aren't you a threat? And that is typically what happens, Phil, is I'm across from the table, or I would argue, I want to be careful not to speak for other GPOs, but why use you when that's what I do?
Yeah.
And ultimately kind of gets back to that open mind parachute concept, or what you think you don't know. And it typically we're cautious when we start to hear that language, because then it turns into, well, now we're competing with you, and that's not our goal.
Yeah.
So
it's funny you say that. You asked me about my perceptions at the beginning of why I thought GPOs when I was in large companies were only for smaller companies, and I think that's part of it. Is and I completely understand that. Having then gone into different scenarios within procurement, especially around outsourcing. So I've been heavily involved in procurement outsourcing. We'd have the same objections from people.
right.
And for, even in that scenario, it was very much mindset. It's like, are you going to look at this as an opportunity to actually provide stronger outcomes, or are you going to look at it as a threat and kind of ignore that it exists, or you kind of keep your head in the sand?
Sure.
And
we try.
Sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
Go ahead. Well, I won't forget. We just try to play the long game, right? So you have that conversation. We say, look, maybe this is not the right fit, and maybe we're not speaking the same language, but keep us in mind, and it's just, you're just continuing to plant seeds and say, look, when it seems very tactical, you have a mission, maybe that's what you've been asked to do, and you're not seeing us as part of your overall procurement strategy, because I would argue, and I think most of your viewers and you as a professional in this space would know, the GPO fits into the overall procurement strategy. It doesn't need to
replacement.
Yeah, it's not replacement. No, it's complement. And so you have to make sure that you're having that conversation and talking to the right decision makers to make sure that that message is clear.
Kelly, I think there was another question that came in.
There was, as a matter of fact. Anthony, you had said that one of the categories that lends itself well to management through a GPO is MRO. We're doing our full TLA alphabet soup here.
There you go.
So specifically about the MRO category, would you say that a GPO works more or less like an MRO aggregator, or can you offer up a little bit more detail specifically to the MRO category about where a GPO like Una is well positioned, or how it works to manage the spend?
Yeah, so if I'm hearing, MRO, right, maintenance, repair, and operations, or we're hitting all the alphabet letters, like you said. I would say where I'm cautious again. So the 800-pound gorilla is the big MRO player in the space. I won't say their name, but it rhymes with Grainger. But they're a great player. And 80% of the marketplace is tied to Grainger. Like, everyone has a Grainger. Every business has a Grainger number. So to answer your question, I would say, are you trying to do business with them, or are you trying to do business with their competition? And it changes the game dramatically. And you as an end user may not care, or you may be very emotional about who that distributor will be for those specific products and the SKUs. So again, I don't want to speak ill will of Grainger or Fastenal or any of the players specifically to MRO, but it dramatically, I believe, and we've understood it and have data to show it, it can change how things come and go. Again, it gets down to this volume conversation. What is the end user? What kind of volume are they representing? You're partnering with the GPO so that you could collaborate that spend. What SKUs are you trying to go after? There's just a lot more questions that would go into it. But I've found, again, in the SMB, when we say small, medium-sized business, and I'll say large enterprise, 5,000 employees to 10,000 plus, again, there's just less of those companies out there. If you're looking at an MRO strategy or solution, and you're already with one of the big dogs or current distributor, it can be there's some amazing opportunities, and some of the ones I haven't even mentioned that may not be as mainstream, may not have as many SKUs, but that's when you start to see certain suppliers get more aggressive. So in fairness to a Fastenal and a Grainger, specifically around MRO, what's in it for them, right? So you have to be thinking that way, specifically as a GPO and as an end user. Not only do we, that's kind of going back to that scenario, recommend that procurement or understand that procurement professionals, what are their pains, right? What are they dealing with? So you have to make room for that, even if they don't want to work with you. Well, the same applies to a supplier. We can't be in the business of eroding margin. It's not going to work. So what's the long-term play? Is there an opportunity where an end user, a bigger business that wants to work with that, wants to look at an MRO opportunity through a GPO? Well, maybe they're using multiple suppliers, and there's an opportunity to bring that in strategically, category management, SKU management. Well, then maybe we sway them one way or the other. At the end of the day, some GPOs are horizontal, or let's say agnostic. okay, without using any of the nasty language. But at the end of the day, is that a best fit for the distributor? And then is that the best fit for the end user? Well, it kind of depends. I'm a big fan, and we're careful with this, of really trying to align ourselves with one supplier in one category, and being very and the reason being is we feel it creates, and we have understood it to create a better relationship. And so when we talking to our end user and they're aware of there's more there, we really try to say to ourselves, well, if we've aligned ourselves with one supplier, against staying within MRO, to your question, we have to really be honest with the end user and say, well, you can look at that, but we've really aligned ourselves with this supplier based on all the spend, the additional amenities and value beyond cost savings that they're bringing. And so the relationship does play a role, the speed, the opportunity, the data, and then really bringing, I would say, kind of this perfect triangle of the supplier, the end user, and then we could use UNO or whatever the GPO together, and saying, how can this be a harmony, not a, well, you have to do this supplier because it's in the contract that we've made. No, how do we make it a win for the supplier as well? And so it gets back to, that's where you really find the value, and you have to understand, what is it that the supplier is trying to accomplish? What markets are they trying to go after? Does it even make sense to introduce this end user to that specific? So then, which gets back to the whole questions before we make assumptions.
You know, I want to add, there's a couple of things I want to jump into on that, but one of the things, and this goes to my perception as well, I think when I didn't know as much about the GPO space, is the fact that, you know, you have these, let's just say you have these 10 contracts sitting out there, and the role of the GPO is, I'm going to just slot you into one of those 10 contracts, you get the cost savings, and then you're done. And that was, you know, my belief before I started getting involved more and understanding more of a GPO. Is that something that you often hear as well?
We do hear it, and sometimes you can fall victim to it, because it can be such a sweet opportunity to pick up a few categories, help a business out, and then if you haven't set, it comes down to expectations and making sure, what are you promising and what are you delivering, and what is it that end user really wants, right? It gets, again, what is it that they want, and what KPIs are they trying to achieve and hit and exceed? But ultimately, you know, what we've tried to do in the marketplace as an UNA brand, as a brand and as a company, I want to talk about core values, and we've understood that by representing core values, although, you know, some days are better than others, we find that the customers do the best with, and that we're able to manage the most spend with them and the suppliers. We have an alignment from a core value standpoint. Well, we do the same thing with our suppliers as well. And it's through that alignment that you start to develop, ideally, a real relationship, and you have a real conversation like we're having right now. And the conversation could lead to, well, you know, let's get through to these couple of categories, but, you know, I don't have a handle on the data. I don't have a handle on the benchmark. How do I know if this is competitive? Mm-hmm. What other things do you all offer? And are there other things I should be thinking about in the marketplace? Do you know anybody else that maybe is in the procurement space that maybe we could work with, or that could be on our team? I mean, as an example, Phil, I noticed that through your brand, you reached out, I think it was today, saying, hey, there's a contract opportunity for somebody to fill a space in the company. So it's thinking, how can you plant more seeds? How can you continue a more disproportionate value? And it's amazing the conversations that open up that can go way beyond what I think I heard you correctly, just that initial transaction. How can you get away from just the transaction?
Right, because I think that's a perception, at least it'll be the perception of some, is that that's what it is more of a transaction around certain suppliers. But I have a follow-up, and this actually ties in with a question that we received from Path beforehand. Path actually asked the question about MRO, so it's an interesting kind of segue as well. The question, and I'm going to, hopefully Path doesn't mind, I'm going to rephrase it. The question as asked was, how do you do cost benchmarking for various commodities and indirect sourcing? So I'm going to rephrase that in the context of GPO, and to say, you know, you were talking about you like to have a single supplier in one space that helps you build stronger partnerships with those providers. Like, how are you as a GPO ensuring that those deals with those providers are competitive and that they remain competitive, and therefore your clients are going to be getting as good a deal as they can.
So it's kind of like sharing the secret sauce a little bit, but ultimately it is our job as a GPO to make sure that we're doing that cost indexing and benchmarking properly of what we're seeing in the marketplace, not only through our current customers or any of our affiliates. So I would say it's kind of twofold. What's the volume of spend running through that category with that specific supplier or multiple suppliers? That's going to dictate a certain price point or a certain arrangement or contract. And then the other piece that's part of that as well, because it's a long and I'll say arduous process to write these contracts, is what do the price increase limitations look like? And how is that set up on the front end to, it's kind of like locking in, and think of commodities again. How can you use volume you have today to lock in pricing over the next 3 years, or a version of it, or limit the exposure and make it a win-win? So it's a twofold deal. We've not only you're benchmarking on something that you might be writing this year or that you wrote 2 or 3 years ago, and depending on a commodity and category, you're going to be somewhat limited on how you can lock that in. But the other benefit from GPOs, I kind of look at it as furthering along, is that you should be able to experience as an end user, you should be able to experience a limitation of some of that natural inflation. Whereas you're just working directly with a supplier and you don't have substantial amount of volume, you may not work that into your contract. Now, most of the procurement professionals are thinking, not only are they thinking, I'm going to benchmark this, I want to see multiple market baskets or solutions or offerings. Then they're thinking about inflation. Then they're thinking about costing and how that's going to elevate. I want to control that, or I want a fixed price. So a lot of that is maybe assumed for a lot of the procurement professionals out there, and that's some of the conversations that come up. But again, it comes down to opportunity cost. So I'm going to wave the GPO flag here a little bit. Obviously, I have an upfront bias. We do that all for you. So if you're doing that, or your team members are doing that in categories that maybe don't move the needle as much, is that the best use of your time? Because if you're over here doing something, over here doing whatever it is you're doing, ideally hopefully it's a priority. You're not doing, well, everything can't be a priority.
Yeah. I just want to mention to the audience again, if you are listening in, you have any questions, please feel free just to include them in the questions area of GoToWebinar, and we'll get to them. I just wanted to put that out there before. Yeah, I know we've got more questions that we can get through today. We've got a bunch of good ones.
Good.
That conversation led me to think about, as a procurement organization, you're thinking about, should I use a GPO? It's basically make or buy. Should I invest in category expertise in a particular category or not? Or should I use a generalist in a particular category? Or should I partner with a GPO? What are some of the considerations that a procurement organization should be making when they're doing that study? How should they be comparing the options internally versus going with a GPO?
So I think it gets back to its opportunity cost, or the Pareto Principle. I think it's this scarcity model, or what do you have available, right? So how big is your team? And then what have you identified? Is your team 6? Is it 60? Do you have floors? Do you have teams of people going through SKUs? I think you start to get that large. You're talking about the Fortune 1000, although I know there are some significant Fortune 1000 players working with certain GPOs, some of our competitors, and seeing extraordinary value. But again, it kind of gets back to those, what are your goals? And if it's just beyond savings, if it's locking in certain contracts, if it's managing the suppliers, do you have any technology, either that you've bought or leased or you're building that that funnels through, or an ERP system, whatever? I mean, it's really start to get complicated here. We can go down some rabbit holes. How does that all fit in? Are you piecemealing things, or are you looking? Do you have enough of a support of, let's call it, pillars within your procurement team to support going outside of what you've already been doing? Do you know why what you're doing today is working and it isn't? So again, it gets to a lot of these questions. I'd want to know the answers to that, and then really get support from C-suite, or if it's starting at C-suite, if we define what success looks like, sometimes we might even start with a conversation with a company, big or small, again, relative term. We just start there. What does success look like within the category of managers or your KPIs, or are you doing anything around data management? And what have you done in the past with suppliers? What's worked, what hasn't? Can we share what's worked? Can we share testimonies? Can we share case studies?
Mm-hmm. When we teed up this conversation, we talked about, automating procurement without spending a dime. The idea of there's a section of your spend that doesn't make sense to essentially outsource to a GPO so you can focus again on, and we're really big advocates of this at Procurement, is focusing on the 20% internally that has the most material impact on the competitive advantage of a business, and then look at how we can enable self-sourcing or other channels to manage the rest, to make sure that it's still managed, it's not forgotten about, there's some structure around it. When you think about the idea of automation and outsourcing, you think about they're going away, I don't need to worry about it anymore. So my question kind of comes back to it. So you have you're buying a percentage of your spend in some of these categories through a GPO. What do you need to do as the buying organization to still manage both your GPO and anything you need to do to manage those relationships? Because I'm sure, like anything, if a client just goes, okay, I'm kind of done, Una's looking after that spend, good luck, you're not going to get the most out of that engagement as you could do.
Sure. So it kind of comes back to the core value piece, like what's the relationship like, and how are they wanting to do business compared to how we do business? And I think of it as kind of a leadership principle. People respect what you inspect.
Mm-hmm.
So from a management perspective, what is it that the GPO is doing, and what is it that the business is doing, and what is it that the supplier is doing? So then I think where it can get a little bit, what are the expectations? And then not only the expectations, which is great, set them, but then we all know the reality is, what's the ongoing accountability? Mm-hmm. What does that really look like? Where can we kind of consider ourselves in this scenario, if you look at that triangle between the GPO, the supplier, and the end user, as I don't want to say big brother because that has bad data implications, but the helping hand to make sure that the relationship is harmonious. Well, we can give specifically, hey, these are the things that you need to think about with your supplier if you're already not doing it. These are the items and categories that you should be inspecting. These are the questions you should be asking, not only to your supplier, and some of the things that you can do as an end user that we can't help with, when maybe it's service levels, maybe it's additional things that could go on top of what exists in the contract because you've committed so much volume, or you've made these requests, or you've built a real relationship, or you understand what the supplier, it's understanding the needs. There's a little bit of salesmanship in the whole deal. And being fair and equitable and just on how are you arriving as a business and making some of these conclusions and making some of these decisions. And if you have 1,000 locations, are your expectations fair and equitable with the supplier on how quickly things could go? And then when the supplier turns around and asks for compliance and you're looking at certain SKUs, it becomes, how do we make sure that both of those, how do we all play nice in the sandbox? Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to add a kind of follow-up in terms of governance. So as a buying organization, is your governance around those categories and with those suppliers with the GPO, or is it still with the suppliers? Or are you all part of a single governance structure or framework?
Yeah, so governance seems pretty official, which we're open to. I think that language.
It's more like managing the relationship.
Starting in.
Yeah. Who do you manage the relationship with? Do I manage the relationship with you? Do I manage the relationship with the supplier? Or are we all kind of sitting around a table together, the three of us?
What we always want to do is, even the language of outsourcing, I'm a little bit sensitive to because words do matter. We want to be invited in, right, as an end user, as a GPO, with that end user, with that business, with that relationship. And so, but we never want to be a hindrance to moving something forward or making a change. And I say we, the GPO side of that relationship. So really what our job is it's kind of, how can we work with the end user and continue that ongoing relationship and say, great, the supplier is our customer, but we brought in this other customer to work with our supplier customer. So what were the expectations given by you? And ideally up front, it's a three-way kumbaya. Well, this is what we understood. This is why we wanted to work with the GPO. Great, we've had either a previous relationship with that supplier, and now we want to work with through the GPO, or maybe it's a totally different supplier, distributor, manufacturer. But ultimately, it I use the word governance. From a standpoint of progress, we want to be we want to be a part of that solution, not part of that hindrance. When it comes from accountability, what we have found, and a lot of our end users or businesses that say, hey, this makes sense, or the GPO models make sense, is we become a second layer of accountability with the supplier. Yeah. And ideally, though, we want to make sure that those lines of communication are staying open and fresh, and that there is a quarterly and annual review, and that we're looking for new ways to help the end user or the business succeed beyond, well, you work with us in our category, and this is what we did last year, and here's how we've saved you money based on the index and lack of inflation or XYZ, and what other things can we be reaching for? There's a book called The Challenger. I think it's a Challenger sale, and we don't believe it, Una, that the customer is always right. But there's a big difference between challenge and argument. Yeah. And I think it's understanding, well, again, it gets back to, be careful what you're convinced of and having an open mind. And challenging, well, when someone asks you a question, saying specifically, well, or GPOs don't apply to me, or I can get a better price. I promise that there's nobody on the planet that can do it better, or I have a great relationship with a supplier. And we always just like to ask, it's simple. Well, why do you think that's so? Or can you explain that further? Can you prove it? Are you open to a different way of looking at things? So it really, these conversations, and then if you can prove it, and then if you can bring value, and then if you can invite that supplier in and set those expectations up front clearly, and then you have ongoing accountability, whether you're checking with the customer or the supplier, we try to do it together. So there's no hidden smoke and mirrors. There's not siloed conversations. And then if they can get them to start working together, and they have a sweet marriage that lasts a long, long time, well, then it's our job to make sure, along with the supplier, what are we helping that end user reach for? What is your data management like? Are there other categories that we can look at? Which again goes on top of it's beyond a transaction, right? Right. And so it's the same Pareto principle for us. So are you doing that for every customer doing that? Well, that would be a lie. But are we doing it for the big ones? Of course we are. Do we want to grow as an organization? Right now we're making some substantial, I'll talk about it in just a little bit, and I hope other GPOs are thinking this way too. What do the next 10 years look like, right? One of the questions I was going to ask you, a phrase being thrown around, is this digital procurement. I have some thoughts, but what do you think that means?
Yeah, it's interesting for me. Like, I hear it all the time, digital procurement. In fact, I hear it every single day in pretty much every single conversation. Sure. Ironically, Kelly and I both wrote a small book for dummies on the digitization of procurement back end of last year. So it's certainly the on vogue phrase. But I think what it misses is technology is only an enabler. And I think there's so much around digitization right now that is being positioned as this is going to be a savior of procurement, or it's going to suddenly provide all these new insights and data that's going to change the procurement value prop. But the reality is that we need the people and the processes, and mostly it's the people, to be able to take advantage of all the opportunities that better technology presents. So for me, I think that technology presents an opportunity to be more efficient, and it provides an opportunity to perhaps have a better understanding of what we spend, where we spend, and hopefully over time, predictively, helping us in our decision making. But it's still all about the human, like what do we do with it?
Sure.
And that's basically where I am right now. It's funny as I go through the hype, and I go to a bunch of these conferences, and it's all about RPA and machine learning, blockchain. I've been in for the last 4 weeks. I've been at a different conference every week, and each one is talking about exactly the same things.
Right.
And it's missing the fact that that's all great, but how are you actually going to take what technology, the output of technology, and create value?
Humans, like, how does that apply to me? How does that apply to my organization? How can I really do that? If I've got 5 layers to get something approved, what is it just going to be expensive, this technology, or is it going to really help? What's the rollout like? And do I really need it?
Yeah, I think that most procurement organizations have yet, in my experience, to really build out a fully developed tech roadmap to look at where they're going. So it's been a little bit ad hoc in terms of we'll try and buy one technology to do one thing, we'll buy another one to do something else. Starting to think about, does that really make sense? So I see there's a lot more investment in thinking about what tech's going to do, but I think we're a long way from, in most organizations, I don't want to generalize with every organization, but in most organizations, tech being a true enabler.
It's well said.
I want to just transition in the few minutes that we have left into more of your entrepreneurial side, because I know that it's one, you're obviously a passionate entrepreneur as founder, CEO of Una, but also that you're pretty active in the entrepreneurship space at home for you, which is in the Kansas City area.
There you go.
One of the questions I had was, as a CEO, what advice would you give to procurement about how to perhaps gain stronger buy-in from their stakeholders? And I hate the phrase "a seat at the table," but essentially, become more of a trusted advisor to folks outside of procurement.
Well, it's this classic line of how can you put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? Have you asked enough questions to understand someone else's position or lens? It's very easy for us as humans, right? We're having this, it's humans doing business, businesses doing business with each other, but it's humans interacting, right? So what do we naturally do? We naturally project how we think and do life and from our experiences. So are you able to slow down and say, well, what is it that C-suite or seat at the table or CEO is really looking for? Do I really understand it? And am I prepared enough with the right data, with the right case studies, with the right understanding to answer some tough questions that might come as you start to get into those level-headed and let's say opportunistic but challenging, conflicting conversations that could open doors or shut doors. But then there's a timing to it, and I think the timing could be, I'm a natural, you say, entrepreneur here in Kansas City. I love that Casey's getting a shout out. I've been here almost 10 years and been a Royals fan. Actually grew up as a Cardinals fan. Now I'm a Royals fan. That's a different story.
A Tigers fan over here, so I sympathize with you.
I hope I hate to say it, but I feel like it's another rebuilding year, but I digress. Back to I think I'm hearing you say, how do you bridge the gap?
Yeah, essentially, one of the things we struggle with in procurement is, influence and having persuasion and being invited into strategic level conversations. And maybe invited in is the wrong word, because I always feel that there's power in your own decisions and your own choices, and that we shouldn't wait to be invited into something. We should be providing, a value prop that's compelling. We deserve it, right? But in procurement, we often kind of sit and wait, or we kind of lament the fact that we don't necessarily have the influence that we want. Like, how can we? I think you said the word bridge the gap. How can we bridge that gap?
So I'll use my lens, which is go, very proactive. We didn't build this organization. We didn't save our way to where we are by bringing value to organizations. But at the end of the day, procurement has a much broader understanding than just savings. We've been discussing it a little bit on and off here. But I think, again, it's, there's a fun definition of success. It's when opportunity meets preparation. And if you, the procurement professional, are prepared, and that opportunity arises, well, if you're prepared, you'll know when the opportunity's there. Now, how you seek that opportunity, whether it be that conversation, that email, that challenge. I want to go to that conference. You bring in that professional. You've got that third party that might come in. You bring in another, maybe it's an indirect competitor, somebody that's already utilized a specific, whether it be a new technology system, or maybe it's a GPO, or maybe it's a consulting advisory strategy. Understanding, I think it goes back to that key to success. Are you prepared? You said you used the word persuasive. I mean, it could be as simple as, have you read the book by Dale Carnegie? What is it? How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yeah.
And have you asked 5 of your closest friends, what's the best way to, we talk about this, one of our core values at Una. Sorry, it was like a bug or something.
No problem.
Was personal growth and professional growth. So what are you doing as a professional, right? It's that's allowing you, and what is your pride in procurement, and how is it conveyed? Are you excited, or is that a place you went to go die?
Yeah.
And if you're conveying that message, and that's all CEOs and other C-suites that are not in your category, well, that's going to come off. That's going to be conveyed.
How important, and what I'll do actually, I'll just pause just to say, if anyone does have any other questions, please just jump in with them. We've probably got a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure that we capture them before we sign off. The last question that I had really about the entrepreneurial side is, and that aligns with kind of what you're talking there, is brand. Like, how important is a personal brand? How important is a procurement organizational brand within the organization? Should we be looking at ourselves as a procurement function as a business who serves the rest of the company, that has our own brand and all the things that come with it, or as a function that acts because it has a certain purpose?
Well, I just in my personal life, it's rarely that things are given to you. You have to reach for them and ask for them. And I believe in this day and age, in social media, and we talk about digital anything, your personal brand, how you carry yourself, it's a really big deal. You know how long it takes you to make a first impression? It's less than a second. And how you carry yourself, how you dress, what you say, when you say it. And then, so that's the internal. We talk about how do you get the stakeholders involved. But then what else are you bringing to the table? What's the additional value? How does that impact? How does that really move the needle? You asked, should there be a brand for procurement and organization? Yes, there should be a brand for finance and marketing and sales. Well, sales, they just say everything and they're just aggressive and they care about no one. Well, is that really, have you talked to a tenured sales executive? Is that really true? And then the procurement professional, whether they fell into it or pursued the role, are they just stuffy? All of them are stuffy. The ones at the ISM, which was last week, which represents 3,000 of the biggest brands. Yeah. So every professional there, all the professionals that have a seat at that table are a part of that. They're all stuffy and they have no personality. They're brilliant and extraordinary. And I think you have a mentor. You ask on an entrepreneurship level, where is there somebody in your field that's farther along? Send an email, make a phone call. Get in the plane and try to go meet them. Send them a card. Buy them dinner. Figure out a way. What's a way that you can bring them value, or you can help them? Help them first. The best way to make a friend, right, is to go be a friend for somebody. Yeah. Well, think about that in the business world. What does that look like? Who is it that somebody that's a really good connector? Go talk to them. What is it you're trying to accomplish, and what does that really mean? Is it well, if I can do this, then I can. And I'm in procurement and I want to achieve this goal. Well, is that your own goal, or is that really set by C-suite? Was that aligned with the company's expectations and visions? So I think those are the things I'd be thinking about.
One thing that comes to mind there is empathy, because I think I know personally it's something that I could have done better as I was maturing as a procurement professional. Is you kind of assume that you know what people think, or you assume what their challenges are or their objectives, because, hey, that person's a CFO, so he must care about its cost savings. Or, hey, that person is in accounts payable, so they must care about something else. The reality is that, while they may care about those things, it may be a long way down the list. It's just the only thing that you've understood that they care about. So just trying to find out those things, stand in the shoes of some of the people you want to connect with.
What's the best way to find out? You ask the questions. Be real. Take them out for lunch. don't be a stick in the mud.
So I have one last question, I think, Kelly, before we wrap up.
Yes, as a matter of fact. Definitely not from a stick in the mud. That's the upside. This is from a good friend of AOP, Helen. She wants to know, how can we use the GPO approach to buying to be more sustainable and achieve better outcomes for our environment?
Sustainability. That's a big one. So we just talked about asking questions, tough questions. I think it's trying to figure out what is it that GPO represents as sustainability and environmentally sound products, and aligning themselves with suppliers that think that way. Is that a value of theirs? Do they have proof of that? And how does that play into what you're trying to achieve as a business? If environmentally sound, those are the questions I would ask. I would say, as a GPO in our brand and our world and how we've connected with customers, it's understood. We believe in it. I wouldn't say it's the number one thing that we're reaching for, or that we are. It's our flagship opener. But I think you got to ask those questions, and then we have it a lot. Certain organizations are large, or depending on if it's business or municipality or government agencies that we might work with, on who are you related to, what do your suppliers believe in, and what are their certain customer bases, and how are they getting their products, and how are they sourcing those products, I guess is a better language. So I think those are the things that come up. I could go on and on, but sustainability is not going to go away. I don't think this concept of the earth and taking care of our oceans and our trees, it's not going to go away. Just like I don't think this health kick for food is a kick. I think it's here to stay. And so I think we need to, I like the challenge. It's actually a challenging question. I think as a GPO, we're in that space, we need to be thinking a little bit more environmentally first, rather than just admin fees, savings, and let's build up our customer base.
Thanks. Kelly, any other questions that came in?
Good question. That was a good one.
Yeah, I know we're finishing on a stumper, huh? No, I think I've been jumping in as the questions have been submitted. You guys are both going to be shocked after the event. There's been a huge dialogue going on social.
Awesome.
So whether people were a part of it live during the session, or whether they're just curious and realizing it now, definitely go check out the hashtag AOP Live on Twitter. Awesome. And you'll be amazed at the back and forth and the nuggets of wisdom that have been shared over the last hour.
Great.
Awesome. I'll go and check that out. And Anthony, I know we're coming to the top of the hour, so I want to thank you for joining us on AOP Live. I know we had a bunch of other questions that we'll make sure that we answer in the post-event download that's going to be available for everybody. We'll make that available to anybody who's at the webinar, and then anybody who's listening as this goes out in a couple of months' time as a podcast as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Kelly. I love the AOP brand and what you guys are doing. It's an honor to be a part of this today.
Hi there, it's Phil here, back again. I hope you enjoyed the conversation between Anthony and I. If this is a topic that interests you further, we did mention at the beginning of the show that we partnered with Una to develop an ebook that helps translate the topics that we talked about into the actions that you can take to start determining if your company should be considering a GPO. You can go download that ebook today. It's at artofprocurement.com/254download. That's 254 for today's episode number. So artofprocurement.com/254download. All right, I'll be back with you next week.